and turn it over to Dr. Brown. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perkins. So just to make it clear, so Dr. Bevens and I are doing separate talks. So we're prepared. Hopefully we'll stick within 20 minutes for each talk. Rather than, us kind of tag teaming on one talk, because she's gone off and done, kind of different research. And this is some research that I've done since she has left the program. So this talk, here we go. So I wanted to talk about the MeToo movement and sorry, to get to the right stuff, see the right stuff on my screen. So given that the theme of Psychology Day is about the media, and the study that I've worked on with my sexual violence research lab that seems to be most relevant to the media is one where we looked at how people think about the MeToo movement. And so just to give you some history about the MeToo movement, this was the impetus was in 2006 when activist Tarana Burke used the phrase MeToo on MySpace to promote empathy with women of color who have survived abuse. And then over a decade later, in 2017, following public accusations of sexual assault and harassment against Harvey Weinstein, actress Alyssa Milano used on Twitter encouraged people to make a statement with the words "Me Too" to kind of show the scope of sexual harassment and sexual abuse. This immediately went viral. So, probably hundreds of thousands of people, well, I didn't look the data on the exact numbers, but a lot of people were sharing this using this hashtag, sharing their stories of abuse and harassment, and it got a lot of attention. So some of the impact of this sort of Me Too movement, this sort of viral movement to share stories and acknowledge sexual violence and sexual harassment, was that it opened up an avenue for disclosure of sexual violence experiences. So the Alagia et al. Did a qualitative study looking at people who had never been able to talk about or hadn't felt comfortable talking about their experiences of abuse and harassment until the Me Too movement. A study that was done at the UC San Diego Center for Gender Equity and Health did analysis of Twitter comments in the week surrounding the Alyssa Milano's tweet, and found that, so they looked at, the kind of types of comments that people were making using the Me Too hashtag, and they were looking specifically at disclosures of sexual abuse, particularly early sexual abuse. But one of their estimates was that somewhere between 6 and 34 million, and they suggested that this range is probably a low range. So tens of millions of Twitter users were exposed to revelations of sexual abuse or assault within the first week of the Me Too movement. So that's, people sharing their story and just estimating how many people would have reached those disclosures. I guess another, and so I guess that speaks to Milano's impetus of first suggesting the use of that label was to call attention to how prevalent sexual abuse and sexual harassment are within our society. So it seems to be that goal was met. Some of the longer ranging consequences is there were instances of abusive men being held accountable for their behavior. So Harvey Weinstein was tried and found guilty. A New York Times headline shows that approximately 201 powerful men were brought down by the Me Too movement, and then calls attention to how nearly half of those people were replaced by women. So, kind of calling attention to the abusers and potentially raising some gender equity in important, powerful roles. Other longer term impacts. Keplinger et al. Had done a study of workplace experiences of professional women, and they measured sexual harassment, and they had done a survey in 2016, and they repeated that survey in 2018 to sort of see kind of before and after the Me Too movement went viral, and found that women were reporting less kind of egregious forms of sexual harassment. So like, things that were directed specifically at them. So like, sexual propositions, like kind of leering comments and kind of, this sort of like quid pro quo harassment. Those things decreased between 2016 and 2018, but they found that what they called gender harassment, which was sort of like people making sexist comments in general or displaying kind of, sexist or sexual material, these things that maybe are not directed towards a specific individual, but that might kind of, make an environment seem uncomfortable from a gender-based or sexual perspective. Those actually increased between 2016 and 2018, and they suggested that that might be some backlash against the Me Too movement of people kind of, wanting to react against feeling like their, ability to express their sexist selves was was threatened. So let's talk a little bit more about sexual harassment. So there's a number of different ways that we can categorize sexual harassment. So we can look at workplace harassment, which gets a lot of attention, which is those things that kind of make it a workplace environment uncomfortable. So that can include things like, expecting sexual attention in terms for promotion, but also just things like making unwanted sexual comments or potentially touching someone inappropriately. But other forms of sexual harassment include street harassment, which is things like comments, staring, cat calls that people get in public. There's online harassment, which is things directed through media, and we can also include sexual assault, which includes unwanted touching, including rape. That is often considered separately from sexual harassment, but could also be looked at under this sort of umbrella if we looked at sexual harassment very broadly. I found this graph of this kind of continuum of sexual violence where we've got a healthy environment on one end and sexual assault, like especially aggressive sexual assault on the other end, and sexual harassment is kind of in the middle. This yellow bar includes like the gender-focused inappropriate jokes and comments. So that was the kinds of things that Kuplinger et al. Were finding increased, but also includes like sexual comments, and then things like cat calls and sort of leering and stuff like that. So these are the kinds of things that those kind of comments, maybe lack of respect for someone's personal space, staring at them. These are the things that encompass street harassment, which is what I'm particularly interested in this study. I'm sorry, I think I gave the wrong citation on a previous slide, but it was the UC San Diego Gender Equity and Health. So they looked at prevalence of sexual harassment, and they categorized it as verbal harassment, which is the most closely related thing to just what we're calling street harassment. They found that this was extremely common. So 76% of women and 35% of men reported some kind of verbal sexual harassment. And this most likely happened in public spaces. So in parks, public transportation, on the street. And other studies have shown that experiencing this kind of sexual harassment can result in psychological distress. While it's generally more on the kind of lower end of that continuum of sexual violence, and these things are generally not illegal. So people are rarely prosecuted for making cat calls. But this kind of thing can increase psychological distress and sometimes result in behavior change. Studies have shown that some women or even men have maybe changed their routines, like gone a different route to avoid these sorts of unwanted comments and attention, and they might increase some depression and anxiety symptoms. So me being a social psychologist, I'm particularly interested in how people think about sexual assault and related constructs. So I was interested in kind of how people think about sexual harassment. So why might people sometimes blame victims of harassment? So I do a lot of work on blaming victims of sexual assault. So in the light of the Me Too movement, I was interested in how might people's attitudes about the Me Too movement impact how they think about, something, again, this kind of sexual harassment, particularly street harassment, this kind of thing that's not illegal, like, sexual assault, rape. These are crimes, but street harassment kind of isn't. But do we think about it in a similar way? So there's some research that shows that, people often sometimes blame victims of harassment. They might see it as less important, or they might tolerate sexual harassment. And some of these studies looked at a wide-ranging types of sexual harassment. But they found that a number of situational factors like exposure to sexually objectifying media, the behaviors of the victim, like how quickly they reported it, but also some ideological factors like political ideology, sexist beliefs, etc. All these things can impact people's perceptions and attitudes about sexual harassment. So for this study, we raised the research questions of to what extent do attitudes about the Me Too movement impact perceptions of street harassment? And then can exposure to different viewpoints on the Me Too movement impact perceptions of street harassment? So kind of like, people's pre-existing attitudes, but then also we tried to kind of manipulate their attitudes by exposing them to one of two different arguments about the Me Too movement. So for the study, we recruited 309 college students, most of them were women, for a study on media and current events. The study was done late in 2018. So this was, about a year after the Me Too movement went viral. It was soon after the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh and the testimony by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. So we kind of phrased it in that context, like, it's been about a year since the Me Too movement, kind of became a thing. We're still seeing issues with sexual harassment with the Kavanaugh hearings. So we kind of used that as our kind of impetus for the study. We randomly assigned people to read one of two modified blogs that we found from the internet that were written soon after the Me Too movement went viral. And we had people watch a video of street harassment and then answer some questions after watching that video. So these are the actual blogs that we used. We did so one of them was taken from the conservative publication National Review that talked about how the Me Too movement had kind of gone too far. That was sort of this trial by mob. The other one was from the online magazine Her Campus, and talked about the importance of the Me Too movement. We edited both of these just so that they were of equal length and kind of equal in tone. But we kind of kept the same arguments that were in the original blogs. And this is just a kind of clip from the video. I'm not going to show it because I don't have a lot of time, but it just shows this woman who's standing on the street corner, and it shows people who walk by staring at her, catcalling her, making comments about her body, and this guy's trying to touch her. And this still, okay, again, I'm not going to show it. So some of the measures that we use. So after we expose them to either the supportive or the critical blog, we asked them some questions about how much they agreed with it. Things like, I think the author made an excellent point. I agreed with most of the arguments, etc. After they watched the video, we gave them a questionnaire about their responses to the woman in the video. So some of the items captured some what we called victim blame. So an example item is, if the woman didn't want men to stare at her, she shouldn't have dressed like that. And then other questions tapped victim sympathy. So things like, I felt bad for the woman in the video. There were some other questionnaires in the study, but I'm not going to include them. I'm just going to focus on the victim blame and victim sympathy as the dependent variables for this presentation. At the end of the survey, we also asked them about their awareness of the Me Too movement. So things like, before the survey, I was familiar with the Me Too movement. I agree or I disagree with the movement. In this, it's not really about the Me Too movement. We also asked them about their experiences with street harassment. So things like, I've experienced some form of street harassment, and I've witnessed street harassment happen to someone else. These were all yes, no, or not sure. So the previous ones were a kind of a Likert scale, but these were just kind of yes or no. So I'm going to present some of the results from the awareness survey. So for the question about people being familiar with the movement, interestingly, 108 people said that they weren't familiar with the Me Too movement. I don't know where they've been in 2017, because again, this got done in 2018, so it's just a year later. But what we found was that people who were previously familiar with the movement had significantly less blame and more support for the victim than people who were unfamiliar with the movement. Just to explain these graphs, so red and blue bars are significantly different from each other. Purple bars means they're not significantly different from either of the other groups. Green bars mean that, so basically when we see red, blue, and green, that means that all three of those means are significantly different from each other. For the question of, I agree with the Me Too movement, again, we found that people who said, yes, I agree with the movement, had less blame and more sympathy. People who did not agree with the movement, more blame, less sympathy. People who, said, maybe, I'm not sure, we're kind of in the middle in sympathy, but similar to the people who said no in blame. Kind of completely opposite results for I disagree with the movement. Again, saying yes, I disagree means more blame and less sympathy. Interestingly, while, on average, sympathy was higher than blame amongst those people who said that they who said no to I agree with the movement or yes to I disagree with the movement, their blame and their sympathy scores are pretty much identical. So they're just as likely to say that, oh yeah, she shouldn't have done that, or this is kind of her fault that she's getting this attention, and like, yeah, I feel bad for her. They're kind of equivocal there, which is interesting because normally we find that sympathy towards victims is a whole lot higher than blame towards victims. All right, I'm going to skip over these next two just in the sake of time. They're very similar results. And then talking about people's experience with street harassment, people who said yes, that they had experienced some form of street harassment, which, by the way, was 157 of our participants. So more than half of them had experienced some form of street harassment. Those people had less blame and more sympathy than people who said no, they had not experienced harassment. And people who had witnessed harassment happening to someone else, same thing. They had less blame and more sympathy. The kind of main thing we were interested in is exposing people to this, either the supportive or the critical blog. Would that have an impact on how they thought about sexual harassment? Turns out no. There was no main effect for exposure to either whether they were exposed to the critical or the supportive blog. Their victim blame and their victim sympathy scores were pretty similar. But what we did find was when we asked people, did they agree with the arguments that they read? We found that there was an interaction between agreement with the blog and the type of blog that they had read. So people who read the critical blog, so that's the red line. So the ones that said that, it's kind of gone too far, it's, this isn't the way we should be addressing sexual harassment and sexual violence. It didn't really matter whether they agreed with that. But for people who read the supportive one that said that, this is a great thing, it's allowed women to open up about their experiences, people who disagreed with that supportive blog, so that's the black line, they had significantly higher victim blame and significantly lower sympathy with the victim. So again, this kind of goes along with the previous findings that it's sort of less about kind of moving people's attitudes around, but about the attitudes that people brought with them. So those who are kind of inclined to disagree with the Me Too movement showed the sort of less sympathy and the greater tendency to blame a victim of street harassment. So just to kind of wrap everything up, again, we found no evidence that exposing people to arguments supporting or opposing the Me Too movement impacted their perceptions. But we did find that pre-existing attitudes mattered. People who had prior support had less blame and more sympathy. People who disagreed with the movement had more blame and less sympathy. And disagreeing with supportive arguments was associated with more blame and less sympathy. Just kind of, make a plug for some other research in my lab. So when considering what individual differences might account for these results, so like what's going on, why are some people, more or less supportive of the Me Too movement and more or less supportive of sexual harassment. We didn't include gender as a variable in this particular analysis, but two of my undergraduate students, so Nia Cummings and Noah Hall, actually are presenting something this week. They made a video presentation, which I think is going to be shared somehow, and they're presenting it at a conference using the same data, but looking at gender and political orientation, how that impacts perceptions of sexual harassment. Turns out they both do. Just some limitations of the study was that it's wasn't a representative sample. It's, college students, mostly young women. Also, the blogs weren't pilot tested, so we don't really know how people were really seeing them as supportive and critical the way we were expecting them. Also, the video street harassment was obviously a staged thing, so it was kind of presented as like a kind of hidden camera, see what happens thing. So people may have reacted to that differently than if it had been more of a natural. So like it's clear that the woman was an actress and sort of put herself in that position, so that might have impacted people's perceptions. All right, I think that's my presentation. So Dr. Perkins, do we want to open up questions now, or should we save questions until the end of Dr. Bevin's talk?
I was thinking that, and this is just a first impression, that maybe we can hold off till the end and then just take questions for both of you. That way we can make sure to get both talks in without having to worry about the time. And then we'll just talk about both of your things as much as we were able.
Okay.
So, Dr. Bevens, are you ready for your talk?
Yes, give me 1 second.
Okay, great.
Okay. Okay. So if everyone can hear me, my talk today is titled Emerging Issues in Psychology and Law, Technology Facilitated Sexual Harm. And this is going to be a semi-conceptual talk with some discussion of work I did as part of my PhD dissertation. So, just opening up with a quick definition. This will dovetail nicely with Dr. Brown's talk. So legal definitions vary a lot on what sexual aggression really means.
Casey, hold on for just a second. I was just wondering, were you meaning to post your PowerPoint?
Yeah, is it not showing?
It's not sharing right now. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought that might be a good thing. We'll just take a moment here. There it is. There it is.
Okay.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, so if everything's good, I'll go on. So legal definitions vary based on nations and jurisdiction, but they typically include vaginal or anal penetration in the absence of lawful consent, and represent a continuum of unwanted, non-consensual sexual behaviors that cover sexual contact from harassment up to including rape. So Dr. Brown's talk also covered that a good bit. So this talk is going to focus on male-female aggression, although of course other types of sexual aggression occur, including male, and female perpetrated. But this talk also aims in no way to excuse this type of behavior, only to look at how we might explain and understand it. Moving to technology facilitated sexual harm, which is an interest I have. These behaviors include, but are not limited, using technology to perpetrate or extend the harm of sexual assault as otherwise defined, extend control and abuse in a domestic violence situation, and distribute sexual or intimate images of another without their consent. It's also sometimes called image-based sexual harm. These online behaviors are explicitly theorized to exist not only as a continuum in and of themselves, but also along the wider continuum of sexual aggression. The literature on this, which is largely drawn from law at this point, asserts that online behaviors come with their own sets of harm that can affect people at the individual level, cultural and psychological level. They overlap significantly with the same harms you'll see in the broader definition of sexual aggression. So this brings me to how we attempt to measure these very complex behaviors in an ethically sensitive way. And in my work, I've tried to link measurement issues in the field of sexual aggression as a whole to this emerging area of technology facilitated sexual harm. So I don't expect anyone to read this entire graphic here, but this is a very, very broad representation of what kind of measures we have for sexual aggression in general. So if you look, they can generally be defined or divided into precursor measures. So things that are related to what happens prior to and up to the point of sexual aggression, and behavioral measures, which are, as they sound, going to be more direct measures, but they are very nuanced in that this is obviously an illegal thing, so we have to approach it very carefully. And when you get more realistic measures, you also have to toe the line of ethics and figuring out how you can access this construct without putting people into uncomfortable or unethical situations. So that's something I really wanted to explore in my research. So problems with existing behavioral measures feed into the 3 sub-goals that I have had in mind when developing the measure I'm going to discuss today, and which I will only be discussing in brief because it's pretty complicated. But I wanted to make something that was realistic and ecologically valid, effective for practical implementation, and that ethically circumvents prior measurement issues. And so this measure draws upon the strengths of previous measures and then also attempts to access this technology area. Okay, so I did an online interactions lab study. For the purposes of this talk, I'm only going to focus on the first research aim I had in mind during this part of research. It's part of a much broader piece of work, and I won't get into all the piloting and stuff. But I sought to expand on existing behavioral measures of sexual aggression as a whole while tapping online specific behaviors. So the aim, or the primary aim here, was to design, test, and validate the intrusive behavior paradigm, which is what I named it, as a new methodology engaging more naturalistic measurements of sexual aggression. And I did expect the intrusive behavior paradigm to correlate with other existing measures of sexual aggression, but this is key, not with general curiosity and desirable responding, which will make more sense as I explain what participants did. So I don't want you to read all of this. The intrusive behavior paradigm, which is now circled, is the part that I'm going to focus on here. So I created a very realistic looking Facebook page for a woman we named Ellie James, who purportedly lived in Edinburgh, because that's where the study was taking place. I used a lot of images from someone who gave me their consent, and I posted on it regularly for months before this was implemented. So it did look very real to participants, and it was piloted to be perceived as real as well. And what participants did at the core in this stage was they friended this person. They thought this person was in the other room and they were going to be doing a partnership type activity. And we used screen capture technology to see in an interim period what they looked at on the page and if they looked at stuff on this person's page, because they were informed that they weren't really friends with this person, that they weren't supposed to really know anything about them. And we saw what kind of naturalistic behaviors they engaged in, which is why we call it the intrusive behavior paradigm. So we coded all their behaviors, saw what kind of images they look like. There were some little, I wouldn't call them traps, but images like called summer beach photos, things like that, those kind of albums. And we just saw where they went and how much stuff they looked at, and we counted it up. The other part of this that's interesting and is based on previous work involving chatting, we used the Facebook chat, and we had men, because all our participants at this point were men, heterosexual men, have choices of things that they could send to their partner in the other room. The choices represented jokes and comments, and the jokes were either representing gender harassment or sexual harassment, or the comments were sexual harassment. So we had two measures there, and they got feedback in the form of a thumbs up, thumbs down. So they were negatively reinforced for behaviors that were harassing. And that's it in a nutshell on those two parts of this study. So I'll talk a little bit about our results. This is just a frequency distribution that you're looking at. And this is for the intrusive behavior. So the part where they went and looked around at her Facebook page. Don't worry about the two different times, but as you can see, it's not a normal distribution. And normally that would be a negative, but with a behavior like sexual aggression, which we're trying to tap, and then this form, intrusive behavior online, you really want to see this large group of people who don't engage in creepy behavior, because that's normal. Not all men do this. You want to see this weird little group down here that does a lot, and you want to see this sort of middle group. So this is the kind of frequency we were hoping for with this. And so then this is the chat. And so you see a similar distribution. And that is also what we were going for here. And kind of similar to Dr. Brown's, you see the gender harassment and unwanted sexual attention. but they're kind of close throughout here. So I believe your results were that you got more gender harassment. So this was the comment part where they got feedback. All right, so that's the quick overview of it. They also, we'll go back, didn't correlate with general curiosity, like I said. So men weren't looking through because they just as a person were curious and wanted to see who they're working with, that had no correlation. And it didn't correlate with other measures that we didn't want, and it did correlate with existing rape and sexual aggression measures pretty well, as a broad sweeping statement. So the paradigm arguably taps both emerging online technology facilitated and broader manifestations of sexual aggression. Because we're using social media, I believe we can make a strong argument that we are getting at those three goals I discussed earlier. And so based on legal perspectives, we'll talk a little bit where this falls. So the whole idea of technology facilitated sexual aggression is not currently super adequately addressed by law. There's a inherent pacing problem to the law that is discussed in a lot of these theoretical law papers, wherein the measures that are implemented do not adequately address because they're either implemented too quickly and don't understand the problem, or the problem is outpacing the current laws. So there's a hard balance to strike if we're trying to rely solely on law to address these not explicitly illegal behaviors, but certainly they can be very gross behaviors, including, so for an example of the naturalistic nature of this, so even though participants were debriefed, I did have participants, and they realized that this was a fake person, using the account later that they were still friends with to then harass me as a female researcher. So they were using it to be creepy in the study and then continuing to be creepy later. I think that kind of speaks to what we were getting at here. Law researchers discuss the need on one hand for a digital culture change overall, in line with what I was saying, that you can't rely solely on the law to fix this. They need to develop a set of digital sexual ethics, and that's something that's discussed in length with these types of scholars. On the other hand, law scholars say that we can't discount the law. We need to be able to harness both the expressive and symbolic power of the law. So the law's ability to state what we as a culture believe in and think is okay, and the coercive or deterrent power of the law. So the power of the law to tell people what will happen as a consequence of these types of things. So there's kind of two camps in legal theory right now about how to best start tackling this new problem, because sexual aggression online is certainly something we didn't know we were going to have to deal with until the last decade, 15 years or so. Although there's always going to be a new way to harass women. So we believe our measure allows for investigating these issues, especially via the psychological underpinnings and future research, which the law doesn't even attempt to address. So we're trying to get an understanding so that we can then figure out how and why this is important to then present it to the legislative areas. In terms of feminist perspectives, most feminist scholars think about this in terms of online surveillance as, to a degree, as a means of men controlling women. Sorry. So one particularly interesting perspective is the idea that social media can be seen as a form of the panopticon. which I argue in my thesis should be extended to the interpersonal rather than just the broad media itself. So individual women can feel surveilled, not just the social media as a unit being representing the panopticon. So this brings us full circle to the early idea within lots of feminist stuff that the male gaze can be applied to here the online context. So takeaway points is that I believe this has potential for use in measuring both general and sexual aggression tendencies and specific online manifestations. So to combat the important problem of male sexual aggression, we need to understand it. And that's where this comes in a very fun, rudimentary and future directions kind of way. Reliable and valid measures of sexual aggression need to evolve, but there's promising futures in psychology at this time here. And psychological understandings in line with this timely issue on ethical discourse of technology, facilitated harm. So this is the first behavioral measure of its kind and opens up a range of promising avenues for future exploration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm doing like a little clap there for both of you all. I wanted to have the opportunity for everyone to make comments or ask questions that are associated with this. And of course, you have like a hope that if you have access to so pen and paper, if you want to write down some of this information, I think that it's good for us to be aware of what the resources are that are available to us. And again, this talk is being recorded, so if you are accessing this recording, I guess you can just freeze that. But, so I want to give an opportunity for people to ask questions. If you wanted to write a question in the chat, that would be just fine. If you wanted to raise your hand, that I can try to call on you for that as well. So any questions? I may have a couple if nobody else does. But I don't want to hog it. Okay, I'm going to ask a question then. And this is to both of our presenters today. It's a very broad question. So related to sort of the broader sort of picture in society, you know, in the world that we live in today. To what degree, you can take this one at a time, to what degree do you guys feel optimistic about where things stand right now and where things are headed? To what degree are you trepidatious or pessimistic about where things are right now? And, you know, feel free to be as nuanced as you wish. Dr. Brown, why don't I go ahead and start with you?
I guess I'm cautiously optimistic. You know, I think that we have seen some changes in how our society reacts to, you know, sexually aggressive, you know, broadly defined behavior. Although I think in my slide, you know, there hasn't been a ton of, and I think, you know, Dr. Bevens kind of points out, there hasn't been a ton of like legal changes, specifically like following the MeToo movement. But I think there has been some social changes that people are kind of, you know, coming out and saying that, you know, we're not tolerant of these kinds of, you know, creepy behaviors of people, you know, behaving inappropriately, like, you know, you know, just basically, you know, just being, you know, sexist jerks is kind of, you know, people are getting called out for that. And we are seeing that in a much, you know, that sort of being people holding people accountable for that has definitely increased, you know, in the past several years compared to, you know, the several decades before that. Has it changed enough? You know, maybe not. Is there still backlash that provides, so, you know, that suggests that there's, you know, reason to be, you know, yeah, more cautious that we're going to see widespread change. But the fact that, you know, just like, you know, some of the, you know, you know, people that Casey showed on her slides of, you know, people who have been, you know, have there's their careers and their, you know, they've been faced legal sanctions for being sexually aggressive. And so yeah, so I don't know, like.
Well, I would respond that I'm a bit less optimistic, if I'm completely honest. I think these things have tended to go in cycles, at least in my lifetime. I believe 1991 was declared the year of the woman after the Clarence Thomas hearings. And the year I started my PhD, or the year after, we saw the exact same thing happening with Brett Kavanaugh. And other things that are problematic with just going off the Supreme Court itself, I would love to recommend, just real quick, a podcast called 5-4. And it discusses a lot of the signaling that's going on with the court right now. I think Roe is in trouble, and I think that we're all need to be quite vigilant, just because certain political things have changed and certain consciousness things have changed. I don't think that the law has followed strongly enough or at all. I think a lot of it has been rhetorical at this point, and we need to follow through with some of the things for me to feel like I can be optimistic. I mean, Louis C.K. won a Grammy like 3 days ago, so I'm not feeling like the repercussions for these men are permanent, and I feel like there's just as much backlash towards the MeToo movement as going too far and being a witch hunt, et cetera, as there is benefit to it, and that worries me a lot.
Actually, would say is that on topics such as this, perhaps the world needs both optimists and pessimists. You know, that because I think that both of those perspectives offer something very valuable to the bigger picture. Because yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I also feel that it is a form of optimism to face these things head on and work towards researching them. And it's not wrong to be optimistic and see the positives that are out there, but we need to understand how big the problem is at the same time.
Yeah. Chiming in, Harriet Swansea Baffolks commented, sexual harassment is really a big problem here. And when you say here, where you are at, Harriet? In your country?
She mentioned she was from Ghana.
I'm talking of my country, Ghana. It's really a big problem here. So I agree with the last presenter by saying that we have to understand it, because so many people are not aware that it's even their right to seek justice when they're harassed. You have a lot of girls, a lot of women, shying away from seeking justice, because even sometimes when you go to the police station, they connive with the perpetrators, take money, and at the end of the day, you don't get to seek justice. So it's really a problem here. And I'm praying we get to a point where we'll be able to, help more women overcome it.
Yeah. And I think that I think that it's good for some of us. I think that our speakers and yourself are well aware of this, but it's good for some of the others among us to always keep in mind the global nature of these issues and how they manifest in slightly different ways across the globe, but they're everywhere. And both to not assume that it only happens here or to assume that something only happens elsewhere. You know, things such as trafficking, are problems all around the world, including in the United States. And sometimes we forget about that. I was kind of interested in the topic comment that's related to some of the pushback from certain elements of society on things such as the Me Too movement. And I think that like one of the things that happens with major sorts of issues like this is that oftentimes there are disagreements that affect the narrative, that people are trying to change the narrative or the meaning of different types of things. So then those who are, for whatever reasons, against the Me Too movement, it seems to me that part of what they do as a technique is that they try to change the narrative or change public image of that or people's impression about what that's about. And I was wondering if either of you was any aware of what kind of research is being done about the changing sort of perspective or definition of what the Me Too movement is for people. And, is that something that could be done if it's not being done right now?
I'm not aware of research that has specifically looked at kind of how the narrative is changing. I was actually thinking about talking about this in my talk, but I kind of didn't. I guess I don't know if it's been research, but it does seem that the Me Too movement has kind of, meant different things to different people. That actually, like Tarana Burke really like intended it to call attention to people who had survived sexual aggression, like sexual assault, particularly women of color, and to kind of increase solidarity and empathy, so like bringing survivors together and having that kind of common ground. And then when it kind of reemerged in 2017, I guess some interesting data that I saw was that the participants were more white women, whereas Tarana Burke had intended it to be focusing on women of color. The participants in the Me Too movement in 2017 were more likely to be white women compared to women of color. So that's one shifting of the sort of narrative around the Me Too movement. Also, we see kind of this maybe I'm not sure the right words, but like I talked about, kind of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And while these two things are both part of this overarching, continuum of sexual violence, they're sort of part of this culture that excuses and allows for unwanted sexual advances and behaviors, etc. But where we want to put our focus has sometimes shifted. So I think Alyssa Milano specifically referred to sexual harassment in her tweet, and that started like kind of one avenue of people thinking about kind of sexual harassment, both including like workplace harassment, but also this like street harassment, the things that I talked about. But then there was also this recognition of sexual assault more specifically, kind of referring back to what Tarana Burke had originally referenced. And again, I don't know if there's been official discourse around this, but I do know that there are kind of tensions like, are we focusing more on this sort of broader picture of sexual harassment or more specifically on like criminal behavior and sexual assault? Are there lines that need to be drawn between that? And again, I'm not really sure about the research there, but I do think that there are a lot of nuances in how we talk about and think about these things.
Yeah, I very much agree, Dr. Brown. And just as it touches on the differences between sort of white feminism and the problems with white feminism, I think it would be just important to acknowledge here the different experiences of women of color and trans women in particular, especially because that is a big issue right now. Particularly because I did my research in the UK and I know that trans issues are very front and center right now. So I just want to acknowledge those areas, because I think white feminism tends to broaden it and do a bit of concept creep, if you know what I'm saying. And so we should always kind of bring it back to the individualized experiences where we can.
Well, I know I need to be conscious of the time here. We're a little bit past the 10-minute warning time, and there's a 10 o'clock talk coming up. So I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up for today. I want to thank both Dr. Brown and Dr. Bevens for sharing your work. I think it's I can't say enough how important I think this work is, and how much of a contribution it's making to the scientific community and to the world. So keep doing what you're doing, keep following that passion. It is again a type of optimism to be doing this work and to making our little like contributions. So thank you, and your contribution is much bigger than mine. So just to make sure about the context of the word little. Thank you all for coming. We have a 10 o'clock talk that's going to be coming up by Dr. Michael, Truthiness Revisited. That will be, of course, on a separate meeting address. So thank you. And the recording will be made available at a later point in time. So y'all take care and have a great day.
Thanks, Dr. Perkins.